from the debate. So thank you for everybody that's in the room already. Thank you for those who have just listened to our conversation about cats. Sorry, but just busy. So my name's Chris, or Chrissy, and Emily and Frank are joining me today. And so I'm just going to give a little bit of an intro and then I'll speak a bit more about Emily and Frank. So I worked in construction now for, about 24 years. I spent 10 years as a setting out engineer and a site manager, and I loved those roles, I truly did. What I didn't really enjoy as much was the experience that I had as a woman in construction, and I started to see my career slipping further and further behind that of my male colleagues, which frustrated me. And so, being a site manager, being someone whose job was to solve problems, I figured I'd just go and start a business, solve that problem, and then sort of come back after lunch and be a setting out engineer again. 14 years later, didn't quite work to that plan, still plugging away. And so I run a company called Constructing Equality Limited. We tend to work around not just specifically construction anymore, we've gone a lot wider, do a lot of work with universities. We've got clients like HS2 joint ventures, universities, main contractor companies. My favourite client, NG Bailey, which Frank is joining us from today. I'm also running something called the Duck Project, which should be launching next year after I finish my PhD. But as Frank will contest, I've been saying after I finish my PhD quite a few years now, so we'll see how we get on with that. So the work that I do is based on research, not trends. And what that means is I don't follow what's popular, I follow what the research is saying. It's not necessarily a great business model, but it's one that allows me to sleep very well at night. I'm very outcome focused. I want to see movement and change. And 14 years in construction equality and diversity in construction has led me to the following conclusions. The first is that there's this kind of drive to see equality as something that's always going to produce good results. And firstly, I want us to think a bit differently. So let's approach this from the idea of health and safety. I think we can all agree that health and safety is something that is important and we couldn't be doing without it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything we do in the name of health and safety is good. So, for example, I once worked on a site where we gave everybody safety goggles to keep them safe, but we didn't have a big budget, so we bought cheap ones, and they scratched as soon as you looked at them. So we visually impaired everybody in the name of health and safety. And I want us to get used to the idea of thinking about equality as the same. That thing that we're aiming for, that overall idea of equality of opportunity and no inequality, that's good. But some of the things that we might do to get there might not always have the outcomes that we want. Second thing is that what we're doing at the moment is not having the long-term impact that we desire. And that's unfortunate, but it's also okay. There's lots of things that we try in businesses that don't work out right the first time. We've got to get to a point where we understand why they're not working and put something better in place. For me, women tend to stay in the industry for an average for about 5 years, and I think that that's a big challenge. It's about retention for me. And for me, one of the things I keep seeing at the moment is a lot of equality and diversity projects seem to be focused on the symptoms and not the cause of the problem. And for me, we've got to start looking at the cause. Trying to get more diversity into an industry where we know that we've got this high turnover, where women on average are staying 5 years and we've barely got the stats for anybody else. What is it that we're hoping to achieve there? For me, diversity is the outcome of your work around equality and inclusion. It shouldn't be the first thing that you're doing. Because if you're bringing people into an environment that is not welcoming for them, that is not inclusive, then we know they're going to leave. You've already got the stats that show that. So you might as well just open a window and chuck your money out of it. For me, focus on your inclusion, focus on making a place where people feel able to progress, and diversity will come as an outcome of that, not the other way around. So we need to take a closer look, and also we need to think about the work we're doing. Predominantly work I see done in equality is based very much at entry level. And also it's focused on the individual outgroup, so women or people from the Black community or people with disabilities. Less so do we tend to focus on the people that quite often do the discriminating, and also the structures of the organisation. So we need to start thinking about what are the overall structures that are impacting upon people? What are the cultures that are impacting on people? And also, what's that personal effect that it's having? So the research that I look at, my thesis, the kind of underlying belief of my company is this, that if I work for an organization that treats me unfairly, then I've got to look after myself. I've got to look after me because no one else is going to. Start to act individualistically when we work in those environments. And if you can imagine, if I'm working individualistically, I start to see difference as a threat because I don't understand it. Now imagine what happens when we put equality and diversity in those environments. It's not necessarily going to have the best chance of success, and quite often it can create resistance or even acting out against it. But there's always hope. So my research is finding that when we work in environments that we do trust, that we perceive to be fair, something very different happens. We start to act collectively because we believe what is good for the organization will be good for me. So it's important to bring other people on. It's important to help other people because it will trickle down to me at some point. When we work in those environments, besides a number of other benefits the research tells us happens, when we drop an equality and diversity initiative into that environment, it starts to have a chance of success. So that's kind of the place where I'm at. And also, just as a little note, how we communicate around equality and diversity is very important. Often people talk about the skill shortage, and I always worry that if we are talking about women and minorities to only come in when we've got a shortage of skills, what exactly happens in a recession? Okay. Do we still need them then? And considering we dropped 2% of women in the last recession, I think it's something we need to think about. So hopefully what that's shown is that for me, there are a lot of areas around EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion, that need to have a really considered debate. But the research tells us one thing, it's that it doesn't really know what the answers are right now. So we've got to start raising these questions. And so I approached the Women in Construction Summit and asked them if we could have a debate like this, and they very kindly said yes. And then Frank and Emily agreed to join us. So Frank is head of learning, Frank MBE is head of learning and development over at NG Bailey's. His MBE is in services to education. I've worked with Frank for 5 years. I'm incredibly proud of him because I truly believe that's deserved. He's passionate and very knowledgeable. And Emily is doing a PhD at, I'm just reading my notes. She's doing a PhD looking at gender in major projects. Yeah? And she's got a program called Reconstruct, which I would advise you to have a little look at. Okay. So sorry, my notes were messed up. Okay. So the way that the debate is going to work, it's going to be 3 questions, 15 minutes per session. The first question is, why is equality, diversity, and inclusion important? The second is, how should we implement it and why? And what are the challenges to implementing EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion? I'm going to introduce each section briefly for about a minute, and then I'm going to give Frank and Emily the floor. I know them both fairly well. I have no sort of Trump-Biden vibes from them, so I don't think I'm going to have to mute anybody. And after the 4 minutes on the floor, we're then going to have about 5 minutes for questions. So what I'm going to ask is, as these sessions go on, please do ask questions. You can direct them generally, or you can ask them specifically to me or Frank or to Emily. But please do ask questions, and the more awkward, the better. We're looking to have a good debate here. So please put them forward. Okay, so question 1. Why is equality, diversity, and inclusion important? So for me, I think it's first and foremost important for the business. And that's why I work in the private sector predominantly, not the public sector. If I didn't think it was important for the business, I wouldn't do the job that I do. And I think the reason why it's important is when people feel included, they're happier. The happy people tend to stay in organisations. Happy people tend to be more productive. And therefore, happy people tend to improve the bottom line, which is pretty good. Whereas people that don't feel included tend to feel frustrated. And frustrated people often leave businesses and are less productive. And sometimes frustrated people can even become unwell. I know I certainly did when I was frustrated and I worked in construction. But let's move to Frank and ask Frank, why do you believe EDI is important?
Thanks, Chrissy. I guess when I think about our business and our sector, probably one very simple word: survival. And it's interesting that you mentioned a moment ago the challenge around skill shortages, and that's something that certainly applies to us as a sector. But actually, kind of prior to that, I'd say before we have a skills challenge, we probably have an image challenge first of all, and the image challenge kind of creates the skills challenge. As a business, we don't particularly reflect the clients or the customers we work with, the communities that we operate in, and in an industry that has already a huge lack in the number of people that are looking to it as a place to go and build a career. The fact that we are viewed as being somewhere that, quite frankly, isn't particularly sexy, but in a lot of cases isn't the sort of place where you can build a career, isn't the sort of place where perhaps you can build a career if you're a woman, or somebody of not the typical sort of white male background, causes us a real issue. Because as a business, if we can't attract the very best people to the organization, we're going to die. And if the situation that we have in terms of kind of our perception in that broader pool of talent is that there's an overwhelmingly large part of it that doesn't think that we are a place that they can come and be successful, then they'll self-select out of any kind of opportunity to work with us, rather than what they perceive as wasting their time in trying to apply. And that situation will then almost becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy for us, that the business then is even more so almost unrepresentative of the communities and the clients that we work with, and the thing just continues to almost replicate. And for us, it's a real challenge. We think of ourselves as we are a family business, and a very large family business that believes very strongly that its values and its integrity are a big part of how it presents itself, and that its culture is actually a very modern and welcoming culture. But we really, really struggle to attract people of a broad and diverse range when we're looking to recruit. And yet the fact is we still need to recruit. So for us, really simply, we need to do this to survive.
Excellent, thank you, Frank. I'm going to say questions to you after we've heard from Emily, but then the same question to you, Emily. Why do you think EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion, is important?
Thanks both. So I think also, just to preface this with, we've had some chats before, and I think Frank sort of takes the realist position, and I try to take the radical position. So I think that's sort of where we're coming from in this debate, and we welcome opinions on the chat about which sort of side you are leaning to. Because I think I have to say immediately, Frank, if it's about survival, then surely these businesses should just die. If they're ultimately not attracting people, they're not modern enough to compete in this new environment, in this diverse society, in this world where we're embracing new technology, why do we continue to have these kinds of companies and this kind of industry that is essentially full of dinosaurs? And that's partly because of the way that organizations have been set up. And we need the built environment. We've always needed it, but we don't have to do it in the same way. As an example, we've only been educating children for like 100 years. So we kind of think that the way that we do schools and the way that we teach and the way that we have a national curriculum, this is the way that it has to be, because this is how we operate within our framework. And I think the construction industry is the same, that we think that because we operate in a certain way now and the organizations operate in a certain way now, this is how it has to be. And so what we've ended up doing is having the core business and then everything else happening on the edges. So EDI is really important, I think, because what it actually is about people expressing that the business needs to change, that organizations need to change. And why it's not working, I don't want to preempt the next question, is because there's this clash of logics that Chrissy was sort of talking about in the beginning. Ultimately, organizations want to survive. Yeah, they want to profit. They want to continue to grow and expand, and they want to use people to achieve that goal. But ultimately, people are about so much more than profit. They're about so much more than their day job. We're very values driven as a society, as a humanity. And so EDI is fundamentally about people feeling welcome in a business, that they feel included in the jobs that they do. But it's also, I think, just about the way that we want to leave a legacy in this world, both as individuals, but also as a community, as a collaboration, and as an organization, as a business, as an industry. You know, we really don't want to have a situation where people go, oh, no, I don't want to work in that. Oh, God, construction, no. You know, we want people to enjoy and find joy and create amazing things and build incredible things with each other, in a way that's positive, and not that's kind of, oh, we've got to do it, otherwise, you know, we're not going to be able to fulfill our targets, or we're not going to be able to reach this contract, or we've got to meet that diversity tick box. So for me, that's why EDI is fundamentally really important, because it's an expression of our humanity, I think.
Excellent. Good start, both. So we haven't got any questions in the audience, so I'm just going to ask one to Frank and then one to Emily first. So Frank, you said that you didn't think construction was sexy, and I would disagree. There are a few things as sexy as a crane and a cherry picker. And I've always firmly held the belief that construction it's vibrant. You get this choice of different roles, like you pick a career choice, maths, art, any English even, and there is a corresponding role in construction. So what is it that you think is unsexy about construction? Or do you think it's less to do with the roles and more to do with the experience?
I think it's back to that wonderful word perception. A lot of people don't know what construction is. And I have to say, I don't sit in either camp. I've never been particularly energized by a cherry picker, I have to say, but a lot of the jobs that we work on are amazing. You know, I have this great affinity to certainly some of the projects that I know we've worked on in and around Leeds, where I live. But it's that perception, particularly in students at schools and colleges and universities, who think construction is low paid. It's not a career, it's a job. It's dirty. It's not something you need to be particularly smart to do. And I guess, you know, in terms of evidence of that, Chrissy, yesterday, and excuse me, I'm going to make a quick plug now. The National Apprenticeship Service yesterday released their top 100 employers in terms of apprenticeship programs. And NG Bailey were 88th in the country, which for a business that has just over 3,000 employees is pretty good going. And yet, every year when I launch our apprentice recruitment, we get about 4,000 applications, which I'm really, really chuffed about. PricewaterhouseCoopers get just short of 50,000 for their program. And I don't think, and this is again personal opinion, but I don't think that accountancy is more exciting. But there are that many more people who feel that it is.
I'd agree with you. And just because I don't think it's said enough to Frank, I think we can happily say that the reason that they're 88th is also very closely aligned to the reason why Frank has an MBE. And so our question to Emily now. Emily, you said that you took the more radical view. And I was just wondering if you actually believed that. Do you believe that your view is radical, or do you actually think that it's just how that view is perceived?
That's a really great question. I don't think it is that radical. I think it's still perceived as controversial. I wrote a report in 2018 that try to bridge this gap between theory and practice, and try to make very academic gender theory accessible, and try to challenge practitioners to think slightly differently about some of the ways that we do EDI in organizations. And I think it was introduced, the report was introduced at one event by a particular senior leader. It was very challenging, very challenging, which I think maybe is a good thing. So it's probably not radical, but I think it is also much easier said than done. And that's really key. I've noticed in some of the research I've been doing through the Reconstruct project, that people that come to EDI tend to fall through a particular stage on a 6-step journey. So I'd be interested to hear if that resonates, and where you think you might fall on that stage. Because step 1 is a belief in meritocracy, right? That everything is kind of fair and it's sort of okay, and if you work hard, you'll get to the top in your organization. And then step 2 is that something happens to you or someone that you love or someone that you admire at work, and you go, hang on a minute, this meritocracy is not what it's cracked up to be. And then step 3 is that you get to this sort of sense of unfairness. I think a lot of us here have definitely got to step 3 because we want to have a conversation about equality and we want to do something about it. It's not fair that happened to me and not to him, or not to this person. So that drives us. And what organizations then tend to do is stop there at step 3, at fairness. And that's because steps 4 to 6 are much harder. Because step 4 is this sense of justice, that you have to make a change. You have to do something to make it better for the people that come after you. Step 5 is then unfortunately a bit of sense of despair, that like, oh God, it's really, really hard to do this. I'm not going to be able to do this myself. I've tried, I've spent my whole career mentoring people, talking about this. I'm the person that bangs on about it on the board or whatever it is. And I'm kind of exhausted. I'm going to leave the organization now, or I'm going to go do something else because I'm knackered. And then step 6 is the really hard bit. And that is the potentially radical way of approaching this kind of topic, and that's around solidarity and community and some of the stuff that you were talking about, Chrissy. But we don't do it again in organizations, because organizations are spaces where you compete against someone else to get ahead, to progress. Infrastructure projects are made up of competition. They're literally about companies competing against other companies to get ahead. So the sense of solidarity and community and lifting other people up and bringing people with you, of inclusion, I think is actually quite radical, because it's really, really hard to do. And I don't think we're there yet. We're not really in a place where we're talking about organizing rather than organizations. And that is why, yeah, I don't think it's radical. I think most people are talking about it as well, but it is really hard to do because, we've all got a day job and that's the problem.
I completely agree. And I find that quite interesting, because I've worked on a lot of projects and some of them certainly have fallen into the last bit that you've described. But actually, a lot of them haven't. A lot of them, there is a massive sense of community. It's that kind of sort of, I don't know, trenches mindset, I suppose. The jobs are hard. What you have to achieve on a project. I think it's Sheriff talks about these superordinate structures, that you can have these very difficult environments. But if you've got one thing that you're all working towards, it can pull everyone together. And I certainly think that is often true in construction, but again, it depends upon who's leading. So I think that's the point. It's all quite complicated, isn't it? But I did like the 6 steps, and I did like recognizing my little journey up to all of them. I don't know where I am now. I think I've entered a new realm of just crying more. And Manon says she enjoyed the 6 steps as well. They were very eye-opening. Okay, so if we move on to question 2 now, I think Jordan's saying that there's 3 questions that have come in on the Ruba app. I'm going to tie them in. I'm going to look at them separately and tie them in to the questions of this next section. Okay. So to just introduce section 2, how should we implement equality, diversity, inclusion, and why? Back that up. So for me, it needs to be tied to the overall strategy. For far too long, I've had people talking about equality and diversity as this thing organisations have to do for client need, for legislative need. It's something that's forced upon them. And I just don't agree with that. I believe that equality and diversity is a tool to help your organisation achieve what it wants to achieve. And if you don't look at it that way, if you look at it as something that you have to do, it's this massive, open-ended, overwhelming thing, whereas tying it into something you're trying to achieve makes it much more neat and doable. And also that you need to get the basics right. So many companies that I speak to have never had a management training process, a management of people, and yet at the same time want to roll up equality and diversity training. If your managers can't manage people that look like them, what chance are they going to have with people that might be different and they might be concerned about? And the same with your policies. Do your policies, are they written to reflect the people at the top of your organizations? And by this, I don't mean your EDI policy. I mean your everyday policies. Does your do your snow policies mean that everybody gets told the next day whether or not they're coming into work, which means people with caring responsibilities or people that need to use public transport are having to feeling a different level of challenge for something that could be easily changed? And do your employees see the benefit of EDI, or is it something they're reacting against because they think it's going to help somebody else above them? Okay, so the point is, if we have these singing and dancing equality and diversity initiatives that actually just look at entry level and that create resistance and foster resentment in our companies, are they helping us get to where we want to go? And I'd like to just ask Emily first. How do you think we should be implementing EDI and why?
Thanks, Chrissy. So my research is about applying a gender lens, not just to recruitment of women in the construction industry, but generally looking at the way that the organisational culture, behaviours, values and systems can potentially have an impact on gender inequality. So I think my research is literally what people criticise as political correctness going mad. Although I'm aware of that, I defend it because, again, organisations are not neutral spaces where well-meaning people come together and enact neutral decisions, right? We're all part of bias and systems and systemic inequality that happens in the world. They happen in organisations as well. So in terms of how we should implement EDI, I think that we've got slightly lost down the route of protected characteristics. And I say this because that for me is about compliance, and it's a defensive response. And it's, again, not about culture and behavior and systems. Ultimately, we have to be asking the question, not just how does this affect me, or how does this affect women or BAME groups or people from working class backgrounds, and coming up with policies targeted at particular groups. We have to fundamentally understand that organisations and leaders and human beings within them all are very complicated, and therefore our EDI should be holistic, it should be embedded, it should be integral to the very fabric of the work that we do. And that is really hard to do because no one can quite agree how to do it. It's like, case in point, but we're having this debate. But ultimately, if we start from a place that it has to be everywhere, and we have to look at it in multiple different ways, and not just as the remit of a very overstretched and undervalued EDI lead, I think that would be a really great starting point.
Excellent, thank you, Emily. I'm going to pass over to Frank now. So Frank, how do you think we should implement EDI and why?
I think, like most things in a business, if you're trying to institute some kind of change, the business has to see what's in it for it as a business. It can't just be something that we are looking to implement in an organization because it's the right thing to do. And I'm not arguing that it's not the right thing to do. What I'm arguing is that the people that run that business will be targeted to make that business more profitable, grow, expand, whatever. And if you can tie the work that you're doing around EDI, around fairness, into helping the business achieve those goals, you're darn sight more likely to get traction and buy-in, and more importantly, resource and budget. because, you know, Emily made a great point, you know, the overstressed EDI professional who typically is sat in the corner of the HR office trying to, you know, plait sawdust. If you want this to work, if we want this to work, it has to offer a very obvious very obvious business benefit. And if I think about, you know, some of the things that we've done with an NGB, you know, I mentioned before about the skills piece. The business is really aware of that. So when we went to the steering group that our chief exec chairs around fairness and said to David, we need to do something about the way we recruit because we're not doing it right. We're not going to be able to recruit from as broad a church as we want. We had a debate about what we wanted to do. We got the finance, we got the resource to do it. When we started to talk to our people in the business about how they felt in terms of how well they were led and managed, really interesting. You know, question number one, do you like your manager? Overwhelmingly, yes, I do. Question number two, how good are they? And you get that awkward, well, they're trying really hard, which tells you everything you need to know. But off the back of that, as a business, we've invested huge sums of money in a leadership and engagement program because there's a recognition that actually, in terms of that, and some of the points that Emily made about how people feel about their business, if you feel that the person leading you is, you know, a gifted amateur, the business that you work for is the person that put that place in control of your career. That doesn't put you as a business in a particularly good light in that individual's head. So as a business, we had to do something about it, and that's what we're doing with that particular program. We had people tell us that in terms of opportunities for development, they felt like actually there was a challenge in the organization around, well, if you're in the right place at the right time and you know some of the right people, you can get in. But if you're not, you're maybe not going to get those opportunities. So we changed how we look at developing people with the potential to stretch. And there's now a self and peer nomination route that nobody can veto. So again, removing that barrier that says, actually, you can get on here if your face fits. And then interestingly, something that you mentioned in some of your points, Chrissy, that there's this piece about actually, when you look at your policies in your business as an employee, does it look like they were written by the company solicitor, or does it look like it was written by somebody who's like me, who gets the stuff that I want to know? And honestly, when we looked at our policies, yeah, they'd have won some kind of legal prize for the use of long words that nobody understands, but wouldn't really have helped our people. So we've rewritten every one of our people-facing policies so that our people actually feel that the policies we have in place are about them getting the best out of being one of our employees. And in terms of the impact in our engagement scores, when we're going to our people and doing our pulse surveys, actually what we're finding is they're starting to go up.
Excellent. And I should say the policies at NG Bailey are pretty beautiful looking now. They're not just written well, they're designed well. Mr. Julie, and they're nearly as pretty as a cherry picker there, Frank. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions from the floor first, and then there's a couple that I would like to ask. So someone's asked, I don't agree with our main challenge is image, so I think I'm going to direct this to Frank. I believe it's the reality that needs to improve and become more inclusive in terms of both culture and career opportunities. Frank, how would you respond to that?
I think the two are linked. I think our perception comes from the fact that there isn't. Our perception problem comes from the fact that actually we aren't changing quickly enough. But equally, you can only start to change that culture within your business by starting to change the people that come into your business. It's almost a Gordian knot to some degree. You know, we still have situations where we have women in our business who will go to site and suddenly discover there isn't a female toilet. You know, and this is the 21st century. You know, we still have issues around PPE not being designed or only being designed for men, which again has changed certainly in our business, but is commonplace across our sector. But again, it's that thing about changing a culture. If the majority feel like the approach is going to take something off them, then there's much more resistance than if the approach is about trying to make everything better for everybody.
I'd like to add a comment to that, because this is actually something that's quite close to my heart. I sat on government had, I don't know, a sub-image group for the 2025 strategy, I think it was a few years ago, and I was asked to attend. And when sitting on that group, it was about image in construction, this subgroup. And I made the point, which I stand by, which is that we have over 3.5 million people working in this sector. And reports come back that a lot of them are overstressed, that they have this long hours culture, that they are generally unhappy with the experience of working in construction, not the jobs. And for me, 3.5 million people is a lot. And when they are talking, and that's, for me, is what's creating the image and the challenges in construction. And if we do not address that, then we are forever held in this bundle. So before we even get to points like toilet facilities, PPE, let alone microaggressions in industry, if everyone's having a terrible experience, what are we encouraging people into? Emily, do you have any points on that you'd like?
Chrissy, your video is a little bit patchy, by the way. I don't know if it's just me. Yeah, no, I mean, and I think I'd add to that, you know, and what is it going to take for us to really value our people, all people? Because, you know, I'm at my own stage 5 of despair, you know, working with some of the companies I've been working with these past couple of years, and I don't even work in those companies. I just, you know, I get to go home at the end of the day, and that's because, particularly with what's happening with COVID-19 and Black Lives Matters, we are having these conversations again around inequality, and that people are really struggling. People are struggling. Women are struggling to manage all the things that they're managing, you know, with family, with careers, with everything that kind of women have to deal with. And men are really struggling. We have such a huge mental health crisis in this industry, and people generally are struggling. And what we're looking at now is I've basically been doing some work with an organisation around, you know, flexibility and again, putting people first. And ultimately, we're already kind of looking at, okay, well, when we go back to normal, when we go back to work, well, that would be very nice if we could continue some of this, but really people aren't that productive at home, are they? Let's go back to the office. So these sort of deeply set beliefs that the business and the profit has to come first over people are just still so entrenched. And for me, they're not one or the other. You know, you have to make people thrive. You have to enable everybody to feel included in order to get your business to survive or to function and to for your business to thrive. But I find it really astonishing that we still can't connect these dots, and I don't know what it's going to take to make that happen. If it's not a global pandemic that will actually fundamentally make this industry go, do you know what? Let's put everything that we thought we knew aside and let's start again with our people at the heart of everything that we do. And I hope that there are some people, and I think that there are some people doing that in pockets across this industry. So definitely part of this is, you know, amplifying those good leadership and those good examples. And it's not to bash people over the head with it and say, you're not doing this good enough, you need to work harder. Like the opposite. It's about taking a breather and going, okay, actually, you know, we really have to do this, and we have to take it seriously, and we have to prioritize it. And I don't know what it's going to take, because yeah, I'm just at stage 5 at the moment, so that's all.
It gets worse, but then it gets better. Don't worry. It's big organizations, different stakeholder needs, about starting to draw these things together and selling the benefit, not just that's the right thing to do. Let's change. We're going to be quick with these answers, please, because we're running to this second question. But someone's asked, how do you balance recruiting diverse staff with having the right level of qualifications? Are mentorships being used? And I just want to quickly point out, I find this really interesting in an industry that I find has a very poor level of meritocracy. We usually employ people because we know them, not because they have qualifications. I find it interesting that the question of diversity nearly always follows one around qualification. So Frank, I'm going to ask you, how do you feel the balance between recruiting diverse staff and the right level of qualification?
I think it's a challenge for all the reasons you've just mentioned, Chrissy. And certainly as a business, one of the things that we are very focused on is whilst at one level, yeah, there's a I guess a basic level of qualification that we need, particularly if we're looking at apprenticeships as an example. But actually, in terms of how we recruit, it's the old adage, you know, you recruit on attitude. And if somebody's values, if their attitude is in line with the culture and the values of your business, then you work on the principle that you can train the other stuff in. You know, that, because actually, you know, you think about it, changing somebody's attitude and view of the world is a darn sight harder than teaching them how to put cable up. So we try to look for people that culturally fit the organization and then focus on giving them the very best training we can.
Thank you, Frank. I love that analogy. I would agree, having worked with both, the cable is easier. Yeah. I'm going to move on to our question 3 now. The questions that I haven't responded to yet, I'm going to gather at the end because I think they're going to link in anyway. So question 3 was about what are the challenges to implementing equality, diversity, inclusion, and why hasn't it worked? For me, I think it's, as I mentioned earlier, we've got to look at equality and diversity in different ways and different levels, that strategic level, not just this ad hoc hint here and there that's not linked to anything, but something that really does matter to the organization. And at the moment, as Emily was saying, it's just not prioritized. It's just not backed, unfortunately, often by many people other than the poor EDI team that are desperately trying to get everyone on board. And I think a change in language and perspective will help us to be able to gather more around it, again, much like Frank was saying. And I think that leads to a lot of fatigue and frustration in EDI professionals. I've seen a lot of it, and it genuinely breaks my heart. Then there's that cultural piece. We assume that people are supportive of equality, where my research has found something that I thought was very interesting, which is people often are very good at saying that they're supportive of equality, but if they don't feel that the organisation is treating them fairly, they behave in a different way. It's a sociological thing. I can be supportive of equality outside of my business, but once inside my business, if I don't feel that I'm treated fairly, it seems that people start to do very small things to undermine equality and treat people poorly because they're frightened of getting their toys taken away from them, basically. So I want to go to Frank now and find out, what do you think the challenges or the unintended consequences of equality initiatives actually are?
Thanks, Chrissy. I think I'd almost start by referring back to Emily's point about, you know, part of the problem is the way that everything is structured in the current situation. You know, I remember listening to somebody speak a little while ago on the point about the change in people working from home and how that was going to impact, and them saying that fundamentally part of the problem is that until we start to change how the economy is judged as being successful or not, actually the other stuff won't follow suit, because everything is designed to fit into that model. And if I think about that then in terms of my business and organizations in a lot of cases, you know, you think about how people are measured, how people are rewarded, how people are perceived as being a success in their role, and tell me how many businesses have people metrics that relate to how somebody gets rewarded financially, how many businesses have people metrics around, you know, around their retention, around their performance level in their teams, around completion of development programs, around having people within their teams promoted out of their teams. None of those things typically are part of how somebody is rewarded for their role in an organization. But getting a job done at all costs, hammering the cost down of a job, cutting corners to get things done, you know, all those things that, you know, not perhaps spending quite as much time with your people because you've got X, Y, and Z that needs doing first, and by the way, 4,000 emails in my inbox. All those things in various different scenarios are judged as a form of somebody being good at their job. Well, you know, for me, you achieve what you achieve through the people that are part of your team. And so if they're not absolutely a huge part of your focus, then you're not necessarily doing your job right. And for me, that's back to that management and leadership piece. And some of the points Emily's made about people feeling valued and heard and listened to. But if you look at businesses and ask how they reward their people, how many of those things are on that list? And until that starts to change and people recognize that that actually is a way to being successful in a business, it's always going to be an uphill battle, because, you know, it's the old thing, isn't it? What's the first line of the 7-step process? You know, the first thing you got to do is admit you got a problem. Well, you know, for us as an organization, as much as we recognize some of the real challenges we've got, pre-COVID, if I look at our financial results for the year before, we had one of the best years we've ever had. It's very difficult to then stand in front of the board and go, yeah, but all this stuff's a real issue. They go, yeah, look at the bottom line. So there has to be some kind of shift. And then I think, you know, there are other challenges, certainly from my point of view, in terms of, you know, number one, you're trying to shift a culture in a business. That takes time. And I think there's a lot of stuff you have to do in terms of keeping your senior team with you on that journey, because it's very easy for them to kind of forget, because there are other things going on, and those other things are can be good cover for why the work around fairness and equality slips down the pecking order, you know. And COVID's a great example of that, because that's all anybody has thought about in the last however long, you know. And even that, when it comes to people, is about logistics. It's not about emotion. It's not about anxiety. It's about, how do we get people back in the right PPE? And not, yeah, but actually, how anxious are they going to be at having to get on a tube train perhaps to come to work? You know, until those questions start to flip in terms of the order of their importance in a business, we're always going to have, or continue to have to keep having these conversations to refresh people's minds. And almost start again. And I think for me, that's the if we can cross that bridge, we're in a much better place, I think.
Thank you, Frank. Though I worry that you're starting to make Emily look less radical. Emily, the same.
Your cat agrees.
Same question to you. What do you think are the challenges to implementing equality, diversity, inclusion? Why hasn't it worked?
Can I come and work for you, Frank? So I just throw away my principles and just like, never mind the debate. I want to let's join up. I mean, I think you're spot on, because we have created this system where people are rewarded for very specific things. And I think what we've also done is create a leadership model that's based on what I would describe as a heroic, lonely male leader.
Oh, yes.
And that is what all of us, men and women and everybody that enters an organization, are ingrained. It's trained in us. If you work really hard, if you do, you know, go above and beyond, don't show vulnerability, don't get emotional, don't ask for help, don't mess up, push, get to the top. Oh wait, you're at the top. There's no one else you can turn to, because if you do, and if you mention that something's going wrong, or you've messed up, or you've you know, done something very human, you'll have the Daily Mail on your ass. So you know, this is essentially our leadership framework that we're working with, and it's so flawed for so many reasons. And I think it's linked to EDI, isn't it? Because what people then think is, well, I'm not diversity because I'm the white male norm. So this doesn't apply to me. This is about someone else's problem. Or they take it personally, like, why are you attacking me for being pale, male and still? I can't do anything about it. You know, I'm a nice guy. And actually, this is fundamentally against the logic of inclusion, isn't it? So ultimately, the biggest challenge is I think at the moment that we have to have our mostly male, but also women as well, leaders, to find a way to again embrace that sort of 6 step, that solidarity, that they're not alone, that it's okay to fail. And it's not just about, you know, stakeholder engagement or leadership teams, or, you know, trying to be more collaborative instead of competitive with contracts. It's the fundamental support network for leaders and for leadership development that embraces a whole heap of human stuff and rewards that kind of thing as well as the other thing. Rewards the humanity, I mean, rather than not just, you know, bumping down budgets and getting over the line and that kind of stuff. And unfortunately, that is a conversation that that can only happen in those spaces and in those corridors. And I welcome anyone that would like to have that conversation.
Excellent, thank you, Emily. I feel like you two are getting closer together. This is like the opposite of the Trump debate. I'm just going to ask some questions that are coming off the floor before my own. So someone's asked if EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion, is about expressing humanity. Does that mean, and this ties in really nicely where you just finished actually, Emily, so I'd like you to answer this first. Does that mean that companies who struggle to attain a BAME, so Black, Asian, minority, ethnic communities and women, don't recognise their humanity, so the humanity of those individuals? Emily.
Yeah, I think I answered that on the chat, but I'll continue on here as well. I think fundamentally, yes, we've created a system and a structure that's based in bias and assumptions and stereotypes. And we're trying, with a lot of EDI initiatives, to come up with new stereotypes and new assumptions, and we're trying to mesh them together. And what we're doing in that approach is something that is very understandable, because people operate within, you know, what they know about themselves or what they think about others. But it's rubbish at creating organizational change. You know, we are working on groundbreaking projects. We are embracing new technology every day. We are doing phenomenal things in this sector. Why can't we apply the same sense of innovation and complexity and that tolerance for nuance and messiness that we do in a lot of other areas of our life? I think we need to apply that to people, and particularly to our recruitment practices, and not necessarily think of people from particular groups or particular aspects. Acknowledge systemic inequalities that exist and face those, because they're not going away, no matter how much we try to ignore that. But fundamentally address it through our culture, through our organizational practices, through our beliefs, our values, that kind of thing. Yeah, that's what I would say.
I really agree and resonate with what you were saying. I remember when I worked in construction for a time, I really felt like I had to be the anti-stereotype of a woman. And it wasn't something I was necessarily consciously doing, but that rejection of motherhood, to the point where I had injections for my period so that I would not have a period, so that I could be as far removed from a woman as is humanly possible. And looking back on that now, that's incredibly grim. But that was very normal, and it felt like the only way I could survive. Like, this was a good 20 years ago, but I worry from conversations that I've heard that it's not that far removed from reality now. So I was creating my own stereotype around the woman that I needed to be. So if I do that as a woman working in construction, what hope does a white man have for not doing that about women in construction? Frank, do you have a view on that point about dehumanizing and sort of stereotyping women and people from minority ethnic communities?
I think it comes back to that cultural piece. I once worked with somebody who said to me, it's really simple to understand the choices you have to make when you're looking for a job. That there are two types of businesses. There are those that live their values and those that laminate them. And I think there are lots of businesses that laminate them and are stuck in that almost fear of being different because they're frightened of what that means. And I think, again, Emily's right. It's that thing about until there's a continual and loud challenge in terms of things can be different and still be successful. And somebody is brave enough to try and prove it on a scale that is impossible to ignore, I think we'll be having these conversations for, sadly, years to come.
Okay, thank you. And I think partly sadly, and also hopefully, I don't think we ever get to the end of EDI. I think it's something that will always need progressing. There'll always be difference. It's part of the human condition. Okay, I want to say thank you so much for the talk today. There's been so many comments being made in on the chat. People are loving Emily's 6 stages, so that's really good. And people are starting to ask some really in-depth questions around, so we've got one here, the management of a company that's been there for 30 plus years, and I've linked it to EDI, or the way that construction is moving forward in EDI. As a new trainee, how do I approach and encourage a review of our normal system and the way that employees are valued? And I'm not going to put that out to the floor just because of time, but these are the questions that we need to be asking as well. How do we drive these change in organisations? So that's going to lead me to saying, Jordan, hopefully you'll let this debate happen again next year so that we can move on for it. So for me, to a couple of things before I sum up, I've just put in the Zoom chat links to mine, Emily and Frank's LinkedIn profiles for people that might want to connect with people afterwards. I thought that would be happy. I assumed that was okay with everyone. You can always just not accept the invitations, but I'm sure that you won't.
Frank, you have to accept my invitation.
I think we might end up with some employment opportunities after this. Okay. For me, to sum up, the 3 points that I personally take away from this debate is this idea of radical thinking, and I've quite enjoyed how it doesn't seem that radical to me, and also it seems to be echoing an awful lot of the points that Frank was making. But at the same time, that's Frank's thinking. Is that what organisations are ready to do? Two, there's that point about working together. I think for me, equality and diversity, Manon made a point earlier about otherness, and I completely agree with that point. The ideas around intersectionality, the fact that I'm a woman working in construction, but I was also a working class woman back then. And that brought a whole range of different challenges. And of course, class isn't a protected characteristic, but it was certainly, being someone from a council house, certainly impacted my life an awful lot. So how do we mesh all of this together? And actually, does othering help? Does it not help? And I think that that's important. So that idea of working together and giving us an overarching thing to move towards, I think, is incredibly important. And finally, perhaps one of the most important points that kept coming up is humanity, and the importance of the humanity of the people that we work with and the humanity of each other, I think is incredibly important and incredibly missed, especially when it drives so much of our behaviour. I think we think an awful lot about how people treat us, and we don't always stop to think about how we treat other people, especially not when we're stressed or angry or being less than perfect. I know I can be a bit of a nightmare, but I'm working on it. So we've got 2 minutes left. So I just want to thank Jordan for allowing this debate to go ahead, everybody for coming along and doing the pleasure of listening to us and asking questions and engaging. And mostly, I really want to thank Frank and Emily for giving up our time. When Emily's, please read Emily's report, have a look at her website, and have a look at her PhD. Read her PhD when it's finished. It deserves to be read. And Frank, we should just all bow down to his great work in MBE. He's as good as he makes out, honestly. So thank you very much for all of your help and all of your attendance today.